The flight attendant's voice cracked through the cabin, sharp and loud enough to make heads turn. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of your seat right now." The sentence landed like a slap. The woman by the window did not move. She looked up slowly, her eyes steady, her hands folded on her lap as if the accusation had missed her entirely. Business class on Heritage Air Flight 317 felt less like a cabin and more like a church right before a funeral. The engines hummed low and even, a sound meant to soothe, but tension crept between the seats like cold air under a door. Outside the oval windows, the late afternoon sky stretched pale and endless as the plane taxied toward the runway at Boston Logan. The woman in the window seat was named Eleanor Watkins, 58 years old. Gray threaded softly through her dark hair, pulled back in a simple twist at the nape of her neck. She wore no jewelry except a thin gold watch, the kind you bought once and kept forever. Her jacket was neatly pressed, her shoes sensible. Nothing about her said luxury. Nothing about her said trouble. And yet here she was, being told to stand up while 24 strangers watched. Across the aisle, a man leaned back in his wide leather seat, one ankle resting over his knee. Richard Coleman did not look surprised. 64, broad shoulders, expensive glasses perched low on his nose. He watched the scene with the detached interest of someone observing a problem he no longer believed belonged to him. His lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, more like satisfaction. "Is there an issue?" he asked, his voice calm, polished, the tone of a man used to conference rooms and closed-door conversations. He didn't look at Eleanor when he spoke. He looked at the flight attendant, as if she were there for him. The attendant, Thomas Reed, stood rigid in the aisle. 50 years old, 27 years in uniform. He had handled medical emergencies, mid-air arguments, even a failed landing in a snowstorm outside Denver. But his jaw was tight now, and a bead of sweat slid from his temple toward his collar. He cleared his throat. "We've received a complaint," he said. "This passenger claims she's interfering with his ability to conduct business." Eleanor blinked once, slowly. Interfering. The word echoed in her mind, absurd and heavy at the same time. She had spoken to no one since boarding. She had read quietly from a thick paperback, the kind of book you underlined and dog-eared, not the kind you showed off. She had placed her bag under the seat where it belonged. She had followed every rule. "Sir," she said gently, looking up at Thomas, not Richard. "I don't understand what I've done wrong." Her voice was calm, low, steady. The kind of voice that didn't beg and didn't demand. The kind that made people lean in, whether they meant to or not. Richard exhaled through his nose. "Come on," he said, with a soft laugh meant to sound reasonable. "Let's not make this bigger than it is. I have calls scheduled, sensitive ones, and it's hard to focus when someone keeps shifting around, flipping pages, tapping their watch." Eleanor glanced at her wrist instinctively. The watch was silent. It had been silent for years. "I haven't moved," she said, "and I haven't spoken." Richard shrugged, spreading his hands. "Intent matters as much as action. We all know that." A few rows back, a woman with silver hair paused mid-sip of water. Her eyes narrowed. Another man lowered his newspaper by an inch. Phones stayed down, but attention sharpened. People felt it when something was off. They always did. Thomas shifted his weight. He glanced toward the forward galley, where a younger flight attendant hovered, pretending to check a service card that didn't need checking. Emily Carter, 34, new to long-haul routes. Her hands were clasped tight in front of her apron, knuckles pale. She had seen the exchange from the start. The complaint had come through the onboard system, flagged urgent, marked by a note that read, "Investor concern." Thomas had read it twice before responding. "Ma'am," he said again, softer now, lowering his voice. Perhaps we can resolve this quietly. There's an open seat in premium economy, extra legroom. We can offer a travel credit for the inconvenience. Inconvenience. Eleanor felt something shift behind her ribs. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, something older. She looked around the cabin. Faces of men and women her age. Retired engineers, former teachers. People who knew what it meant to be moved aside politely, with smiles and apologies, after decades of doing everything right. "Are you asking me to give up my seat?" she said. "Or are you telling me to?" The question hung there, clean, sharp. Richard leaned forward now, resting his forearms on the divider. His cologne reached her, heavy and sweet. "Look," he said, lowering his voice in a way that was supposed to sound kind. "You don't want this to turn into a thing. Airlines have protocols. You comply, they take care of you. You dig in, it gets messy. At our age, we should know when to pick our battles." Our age. Eleanor met his eyes for the first time, really looked at him. The faint redness at the edges, the confidence that came from rooms where everyone nodded when he spoke. The certainty that the world would rearrange itself if he pushed hard enough. "Respectfully," she said, "this isn't a battle. It's a seat I paid for." Thomas inhaled sharply. Emily's head lifted. Her eyes flicked to Eleanor, then to Richard, then back to Thomas. She took a step forward, stopped herself, then spoke anyway. "She hasn't violated any policy," Emily said. Her voice wavered, but the words came out clear. "I've been watching. There's no disruption logged except the complaint." Thomas turned on her, just enough to warn. "Emily, I'm just saying what I observed," she replied, swallowing hard. Richard straightened. His expression hardened just slightly. "Is this how your crew is trained now?" he asked. "To debate customers in public?" The word customers landed with weight. Thomas felt it. Emily did too. So did Eleanor. "Enough," Thomas said, more to himself than anyone else. He looked at Eleanor again. "Mom, please stand. Let's step into the galley and sort this out." The engines grew louder as the plane edged closer to the runway. A low chime sounded overhead. "Fasten seatbelts." Eleanor remained seated. "No," she said. The word was quiet, firm, unyielding. For a moment, no one moved. The cabin held its breath. Thomas stared at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. Outside, the plane turned into position, nose aligned with the long strip of concrete stretching ahead. The sky darkened slightly as clouds rolled in from the west. Eleanor rested her hands on the armrests. She felt the familiar vibration under her palms, the same vibration she had insisted on during design reviews years ago. Subtle, grounding, almost imperceptible. She looked up at Thomas again. "If there's a policy I've broken," she said, "I'll follow the consequences. If there isn't, I'll remain where I am." Thomas swallowed. He thought of the email waiting on his phone, the quarterly audit, the reminders about conduct and equal treatment. He thought of the complaint tagged investor. He thought of the weight of making the wrong call. Emily stood very still, her heart hammered. She knew this moment. She had felt it before, in smaller ways. The moment when silence became a decision. Richard scoffed softly. "Unbelievable," he murmured. "Every flight, it's something." Eleanor did not look at him. The plane paused at the runway's edge. Engines spooled higher. A deep, rising roar filled the cabin. Thomas made his choice. He lifted his chin, straightened his shoulders, and reached for the intercom. And Eleanor, still seated, felt the ground begin to tremble beneath her. Not just from the engines, but from something else entirely. A shift that had been building for years. Quiet, patient, waiting for the right moment to be seen. The aircraft surged forward, pressing every body back into leather and fabric as the engines climbed from a roar to a controlled thunder. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief second, not in fear, but in recognition. This moment, this pressure, this sound, had followed her through decades of her life. It was the sound of momentum. It was the sound of commitment. Once the wheels left the ground, there would be no easy reversals. Across the aisle, Richard gripped his armrest harder than he meant to. He hated takeoffs. He hated surrendering control to anything mechanical, anything he couldn't intimidate or negotiate with. As the nose lifted and the city fell away beneath them, his jaw clenched, and the irritation that had been simmering found a new place to settle. He glanced sideways at Eleanor, still seated, still composed, as if the last 5 minutes hadn't happened. Thomas stood frozen in the aisle until the seatbelt sign chimed again, then slowly returned to his jump seat. His hands trembled as he buckled in. He had made a call without finishing it, reached for the intercom and then stopped, the words drying up before they could form. He told himself he'd revisit it once they were airborne. He told himself he'd done enough for now. Emily slid into her own jump seat near the galley, her pulse loud in her ears. She replayed the exchange again and again, each sentence sharper in hindsight. She knew what she'd seen. She knew what she'd felt. And she knew that what came next would matter more than anything she said out loud. When the plane leveled off and the cabin lights softened, Thomas unbuckled and stood. He took a breath, adjusted his uniform, and walked back toward Eleanor's row. The aisle felt longer now, narrower, as if the aircraft itself were paying attention. "Ma'am," he said quietly, crouching slightly so his voice wouldn't carry. "Let's reset. Once service starts, I'll see what options we have." Eleanor met his eyes. She could see the conflict there, the fear, the calculation. She nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "I appreciate that," she said. "I'll be here." Richard leaned over the divider, unable to stop himself. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "We're adults, let's act like it." Eleanor turned her head just enough to face him. Her expression didn't change, but something in her gaze sharpened. "I am," she said. Service began slowly, the ritual of trays and glasses returning a sense of normalcy to the cabin. The clink of ice, the soft thud of carts, the practiced smiles. But the tension hadn't dissipated. It had only gone quiet, like a storm cloud hanging low without rain. Richard took a call as soon as his phone reconnected. He didn't lower his voice. He never did. He spoke about leverage, about timelines, about a company that needed guidance whether it knew it or not. Names floated through the air, familiar to some, meaningless to others. Eleanor listened without meaning to. She heard the assumptions buried beneath the confidence, the way he spoke about people as pieces on a board. Thomas watched from the galley, pretending to check inventory. He noted how other passengers were reacting now. The stiff shoulders, the sideways glances. The woman with silver hair shaking her head slowly, almost imperceptibly. This wasn't just about one seat anymore. It hadn't been for a while. Emily approached Eleanor's row with a glass of water, her hands steadier now than before. "Here you go," she said softly. "Thank you," Eleanor replied. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not gratitude, recognition. Emily hesitated, then leaned in just a fraction. "If you need anything," she said, "I'm here." Eleanor smiled, small and real. "I know." The hours stretched. The plane cut through layers of cloud, sunlight fading to grey, then to dusk. Dinner came and went. Richard barely touched his food, too absorbed in his calls, too convinced the world would wait for him. Eleanor ate slowly, methodically, her thoughts moving far beyond the cabin. She thought about the last board meeting, about the metrics on culture that looked good on paper and hollow in practice, about the reports she'd read and the ones she hadn't believed, about why she was here at all, anonymous by design, watching the company she'd built reveal itself in the smallest interactions. At some point, Richard's voice dropped, not in volume, but in certainty. He ended a call abruptly, stared at the darkened window and exhaled. The confidence that had carried him so easily earlier felt thinner now. The cabin no longer felt like his domain. Too many eyes, too much quiet. He turned again toward Eleanor, his tone shifting, seeking something he didn't want to name. "You ever fly this route before?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Long haul does funny things to people," he went on. "Tempers flare, misunderstandings happen." She nodded. "They do." Another pause. He waited for her to soften, to agree, to give him something he could use. She didn't. Thomas finally returned, kneeling beside Eleanor's seat again. His voice was careful. "I've logged the situation. We'll follow up after landing." "That's appropriate," Eleanor said. Richard's head snapped up. "Logged?" he repeated. "For what, exactly?" "For the interaction," Thomas replied. "Standard procedure." Richard laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You're kidding." "I'm not." Silence followed. Heavy. Final. The rest of the flight passed without further incident, but the damage had been done. When the lights dimmed for the overnight stretch, Eleanor remained awake, eyes open, listening to the quiet breathing of the cabin. She felt no triumph, only clarity. Somewhere over the Midwest, Emily sat in the galley, typing carefully into the onboard system. She chose her words with precision, no exaggeration, no emotion, just facts. What was said, who said it, who heard it. When she finished, she saved the report and closed her tablet, her hands no longer shaking. When dawn began to break over the Pacific, pale and cold, Eleanor finally closed her eyes. Not to sleep, to prepare. Below them the coast emerged, grey and solid, a promise and a reckoning. The aircraft began its descent, smooth and controlled, exactly as it was designed to do. Richard watched the ground approach with a knot in his stomach he couldn't explain. He told himself it was nothing, just fatigue, just another flight. But somewhere deep down, a thought crept in, unwelcome and persistent. Some seats carried more weight than they appeared, and some silences were far more dangerous than noise. The wheels touched down with a muted thump that rippled through the cabin, followed by the low whine of reverse thrust. Eleanor felt the vibration travel up through the seat, through her spine, into a place deep behind her ribs where resolve lived. The plane slowed, steady and deliberate, rolling along the runway as the grey sprawl of Los Angeles spread out beyond the windows. Around her, people stirred. Seatbelts clicked open, shoulders rolled. Phones appeared in hands like reflexes returning to life. The ordinary rituals of arrival began, but the air in business class remained tight, charged with something unfinished. Richard stood the moment the sign went dark. He reached for the overhead bin with more force than necessary, tugging his carry-on free as if it had offended him. His movements were sharp, efficient, meant to project control. He didn't look at Eleanor. He didn't need to. He could feel her presence anyway, like a weight he couldn't shake. Thomas remained near the galley, posture rigid, eyes scanning the cabin. He avoided Richard's gaze and did not approach Eleanor again. He had done what procedure demanded. Now the rest belonged to systems larger than him. Emily waited until the aisle cleared, then stepped toward Eleanor's row. She held a small card between her fingers, folded once, then again, as if unsure whether to offer it at all. "Mom," she said quietly. "If you'd like to follow up, this is the contact for our ethics office. They review everything." Eleanor accepted the card with a nod. "Thank you for doing your job," she said. Emily's breath caught, not because of the words, but because of the way they were spoken. Simple. Earned. She watched Eleanor stand, noticed how the woman moved without haste, without apology, as if time adjusted itself to her pace. As Eleanor stepped into the aisle, Richard finally turned. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. His expression flickered, something between irritation and uncertainty. He opened his mouth, closed it, then said nothing at all. He slipped past her and disappeared into the jet bridge, already dialing his phone. The terminal swallowed them in layers of sound and motion. Announcements echoed overhead. Wheels rattled across tile. The smell of coffee and disinfectant mixed in the air. Eleanor walked alone, her bag light on her shoulder, her mind already shifting from observation to action. By the time she reached the curb, a black sedan waited. The driver stepped out, nodding once in recognition. He took her bag without a word. As the car pulled into traffic, Eleanor looked back through the glass at the terminal she was leaving behind. The plane was already being serviced, cleaned, reset, ready for the next story. Richard emerged minutes later, phone pressed tight to his ear. His voice was low now, clipped, stripped of the bravado he'd worn so easily at altitude. He paced near the rideshare pickup, frustration bleeding through every syllable. "No, it's not a problem," he said. "Just a delay. I'll still make the meeting." A pause. His jaw tightened. "I said it's handled." Across the city, Eleanor sat in silence as the car carried her toward downtown. She watched familiar streets pass by, each one layered with memory. Meetings won and lost. Doors closed and reopened. Faces that had smiled, and faces that never had. By the time she reached our office, the sun was high, the building already alive with movement. DZ's headquarters rose clean and modern against the sky, glass and steel reflecting the morning light. Inside, the hum of work carried on, unaware of the shift already underway. Eleanor stepped onto her floor and headed straight to her office. She did not stop to greet anyone. She did not remove her coat. She sat, opened her laptop, and began to read. Emily's report was there, precise and unembellished. Timestamps, quotes, observations. No assumptions, no accusations. Just the truth, laid out line by line. Eleanor closed the file and leaned back, exhaling slowly. This was not about a seat. It had never been about a seat. It was about what happened when power went unchallenged long enough to forget itself. She typed 3 emails. One to the ethics committee, requesting a formal review of the incident and the crew's response. One to legal, asking for a risk assessment related to ongoing negotiations with Coleman's firm. And one to her assistant, short and direct, asking for a meeting to be scheduled with the board's governance subcommittee. Across town, Richard strode into a glass-walled conference room, his confidence returning as he spotted familiar faces. He took his seat, smoothed his jacket, and launched into prepared remarks without preamble. Numbers, projections, influence. Halfway through, his phone buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again. Then again. He glanced down, irritation flashing, then froze. The message was brief, professional, impersonal. Discussion postponed pending internal review. His mouth went dry. He finished his sentence on autopilot, nodded to the room, and excused himself under the guise of a call he couldn't miss. In the hallway, the weight hit him all at once. The sense that something had shifted while he wasn't looking. Back at Heritage Air, the governance committee gathered around a long table, faces serious, attentive. Eleanor spoke plainly. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize. She laid out the facts, the context, the implications. "This is not about retaliation," she said. "It's about alignment. We cannot claim values we don't enforce." The room was quiet. Heads nodded. Notes were taken. By late afternoon, the decision was made. The partnership discussions would be paused, not terminated, not yet, but the message would be clear. Richard learned of it from his own managing partner, the call curt and controlled. "What did you do?" the man asked. Richard searched for an answer that would make sense, that would shrink the moment into something manageable. None came. "I handled the situation," he said finally. On the other end of the line, silence stretched. Eleanor stood alone by her window as evening settled over the city. Below, planes lined up on distant runways, waiting their turn. She watched one lift into the sky, graceful and sure. Somewhere inside that aircraft, someone was being seen. Or not. She turned from the glass, her reflection fading as the room lights adjusted. The work ahead was heavier than any confrontation. It always was. But it was work she had chosen. The boardroom was quiet in the way only expensive rooms ever were. Sound softened by fabric and money, voices swallowed before they could echo. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, hands folded, listening as the last of the committee members finished outlining the procedural steps. No one raised their voice. No one rushed. This was not a crisis meeting. It was a reckoning, disguised as routine governance. When it ended, people stood, chairs sliding back in controlled movements. Polite nods were exchanged. Files were gathered. The decision was unanimous, but no one celebrated it. That was how Eleanor knew it was the right one. She remained seated after the room emptied, staring at the dark surface of the table where her reflection wavered slightly under the overhead lights. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it. Not triumph, not anger. Responsibility. The kind that didn't fade once the doors closed. Her phone buzzed. A message from legal. Risk exposure minimal. Reputational exposure significant if mishandled. Recommendation. Distance now, explain later. She set the phone face down and stood. Across the city, Richard Coleman sat alone in his office, jacket draped over the back of his chair, tie loosened just enough to signal frustration rather than defeat. The view outside his window usually calmed him. Today, it did nothing. He replayed the flight in fragments, scenes stitched together without context. The attendant's tone, the woman's stillness, the way the room had shifted without anyone raising their voice. He poured himself a drink he didn't want and took a sip he didn't taste. His managing partner's words echoed in his head, clipped and precise. "This is bigger than you think. Stand by." Richard had never stood by for anything in his life. He opened his laptop and searched. Quietly at first, then with urgency. Heritage Air leadership, board members, past press. Eleanor Watkins' name appeared less than he expected. A few trade interviews from years back. An award photo, slightly blurred. Older than he remembered her looking. Or younger, he couldn't tell. The realization settled slowly, heavy and undeniable. He hadn't just misjudged a person. He had misjudged a system that had been watching him long before he noticed it. At the airport, Emily finished her shift with a stiffness in her shoulders she couldn't shake. She changed out of her uniform in the locker room, fingers trembling as she folded it away. Around her, other attendants chatted quietly, sharing mundane complaints, laughing at small things. None of them mentioned the incident. Not yet. As she stepped into the evening air, her phone buzzed. An email. Subject line plain. Ethics Office. Acknowledgement. Thank you for your report. You may be contacted for follow-up. Emily exhaled, long and slow. She hadn't known what she'd expected. Praise, reprimand, silence. This was something else. This was official. It scared her. It steadied her. That night, Eleanor returned home later than she'd planned. She moved through her apartment in silence, setting down her bag, turning on a single lamp. The city lights flickered beyond the windows, distant and indifferent. She poured a glass of water and stood at the counter, letting the coolness ground her. She thought of the early days, of borrowed planes and handwritten schedules, of meetings where she'd been mistaken for an assistant, a note-taker, a guest, of how often she'd been told to wait her turn. She hadn't waited. She'd built. The next morning came with a sharp clarity. Eleanor arrived early, as she always did, and found the building already awake. Emails waited, calls lined up. The machinery of a company never slept. It only rotated. Her assistant stepped into the office, face composed, eyes alert. "The investment firm has requested clarification," she said. "They're asking if the pause is temporary." Eleanor nodded. "Tell them the review is ongoing, no timeline. And Mr. Coleman has reached out directly." Eleanor considered this. He can wait. Down the street, Richard stood in front of his mirror, tying his tie with care that bordered on desperation. He had decided to go in person. Emails were too easy to ignore. Meetings were where things happened. He arrived at Heritage Air's headquarters mid-morning, confidence carefully reconstructed. The lobby was bright, airy, designed to feel open. He checked in with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here to see Eleanor Watkins." The receptionist glanced at her screen. Her expression didn't change. "I don't have you on the schedule." "I'll wait," Richard said. "You're welcome to," she replied. He waited. Minutes stretched. Conversations happened around him. He watched employees move with purpose, noticed the ease with which they greeted one another. No one hurried to accommodate him. No one asked if he needed anything. At last, a security officer approached, posture polite but firm. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave." Richard's mouth opened in protest, then closed. He stood slowly, aware of the eyes on him now. The quiet attention he'd once commanded now turned curious. "I'll be back," he said, to no one in particular. He was not back. Later that day, the Ethics Committee reconvened, joined by representatives from compliance and human resources. Emily was called in to speak. She sat straight-backed, hands clasped, answering questions carefully. She did not editorialize. She did not soften what she'd seen. When it was over, one of the senior members nodded at her. "You did the right thing." The words settled into her bones. That evening, Eleanor addressed her leadership team. She stood at the front of the room, not elevated, not hidden behind a podium. She spoke plainly. "We talk about culture as if it's an abstract," she said. "It's not. It's the choices people make when they think no one important is watching." No one interrupted. No one needed to. Across the city, Richard packed his briefcase in silence. Calls went unanswered. Messages grew shorter. Opportunities narrowed, not with drama, but with absence. He sat alone at his desk long after the lights dimmed, staring at a single truth he could no longer avoid. Power did not announce itself. It waited. It observed. And when it moved, it did so without asking permission. Eleanor left the office as night settled in, the building quieting behind her. She paused once in the lobby, looking out at the street. Cars passed. People hurried home. Somewhere above, planes crossed paths, unseen. She stepped outside, the cool air brushing her face, and walked forward, without looking back. The letter arrived on thick cream paper, slipped beneath Richard Coleman's office door sometime before dawn. No logo, no sender. Just his name printed neatly across the front, the ink dark and precise. He stared at it longer than he should have, as if the envelope itself were an accusation. Inside, the message was brief. Heritage Air was formally withdrawing from negotiations, effective immediately. The language was restrained, legal, impossible to argue with. Cultural misalignment, reputational risk, non-negotiable standards of conduct. His hands trembled as he folded the paper back into the envelope. This was not a pause. This was an ending. Across the city, Eleanor Watkins stood in front of a room filled with quiet faces. Senior leaders, department heads, people who had grown with the company, aged alongside it. She did not stand behind a podium. She stood among them, hands at her sides, shoulders squared. "We are not here to celebrate," she said. "We are here to be honest." The room leaned in, not physically, but in spirit. Eleanor spoke without notes, her voice steady, her words chosen with care. She spoke about the flight, not the names, not the drama. She spoke about the moment when convenience had been offered in place of dignity, about how easily a system could slip when it believed the wrong person mattered more. "This is not about punishment," she said. "It's about correction." Thomas Reed sat in the back row, hands clasped tightly in his lap. His reassignment had come quietly, professionally. No spectacle, no shame parade. He had accepted it with a nod that felt heavier than any reprimand. Listening now, he felt the truth settle in. He had made a choice, not the worst one, not the best one, but a choice all the same. Eleanor's gaze passed over him without judgment. She did not single him out. She did not need to. The lesson was already working its way through the room. When the meeting ended, people rose slowly. Conversations began in low voices. Some nodded to Eleanor as they passed. Others avoided her eyes, not out of fear, but reflection. Emily Carter lingered near the door, unsure whether to approach. Eleanor noticed her and gestured gently. "Walk with me," she said. They moved down the corridor together, the quiet punctuated by the soft hum of the building. Emily's hands twisted together, nerves flickering beneath her composed exterior. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Emily said finally. Eleanor smiled, not unkindly. "You didn't. You prevented more of it." They stopped near a window overlooking the runway. A plane rolled into position, engines idling, waiting its turn. "You did exactly what we ask people to do," Eleanor continued. "You noticed. You documented. You spoke when it mattered." Emily swallowed. "I was scared." "So was I," Eleanor said. "The first time, and the 10th. Emily looked at her then. Really looked. The lines around Eleanor's eyes. The calm that had been earned, not inherited. Later that afternoon, Richard sat across from his managing partner, the space between them filled with a silence that felt terminal. The partner did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply laid out the facts. The firm could not afford this kind of attention, this kind of risk. "We'll handle the public side," the partner said. "But internally, things will change." Richard nodded, his throat tight. He had always believed his value was untouchable. Deals closed, numbers delivered. He had never considered what happened when the room decided it had outgrown him. By evening, his access was limited. Calendars adjusted. Invitations stopped coming. The disappearance was not dramatic. It was surgical. That night, Eleanor sat alone at her desk, reviewing policy revisions drafted by compliance. Language tightened, procedures clarified, training modules expanded. It was tedious work, but necessary. Culture did not correct itself on speeches alone. She paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, and thought again of the flight, of the moment before the engines surged, when everything had balanced on a single decision. She thought of how many times she had been the person expected to move quietly out of the way. She finished the revisions and sent them off. In a small apartment across town, Emily sat at her kitchen table, uniform folded neatly beside her. She replayed the week in her mind, the fear giving way to something steadier. Purpose, maybe. Or permission. Her phone buzzed. A message from Human Resources. Invitation to participate in a leadership development program. Details to follow. She closed her eyes, letting the reality of it settle. The news did not break all at once. It never did. A brief mention in an industry newsletter, a line about a terminated negotiation. Analysts speculated. People connected dots quietly. Those who needed to know understood. Which had read the article alone, the words blurring slightly on the page. Cultural values. Strategic alignment. He recognized himself nowhere in the language, and yet he was everywhere beneath it. At Heritage Air, life went on. Flights departed. Crews rotated. Passengers boarded with their own stories, unaware of the small shifts happening behind the scenes to make space for them. One evening, Eleanor returned to the same route, this time recognized, greeted with warmth that felt earned. She took her seat and looked out the window as the city lights receded. The cabin hummed, familiar and reassuring. Somewhere in the middle rows, an older woman laughed softly at something her husband said. A man adjusted his glasses and opened a book. Ordinary moments. Protected moments. Eleanor closed her eyes as the plane lifted, not to escape, but to listen. The sound was still there. The sound of momentum, of commitment. And this time, it felt right. The training room smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper, a neutral scent meant to keep minds alert without distraction. Emily sat near the back, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, listening as the facilitator spoke about decision trees and escalation protocols. The words were familiar now, almost comforting in their clarity. Procedures, documentation, accountability. Things that made the world make sense when people did not. Around her, other employees nodded, took notes, shifted in their chairs. Some were veterans, faces lined with years of routine. Others were new, eyes bright with ambition and uncertainty. Emily felt suspended between those worlds, no longer invisible, not yet secure. She welcomed the feeling. It meant she was paying attention. Across the hall, Eleanor stood behind a glass wall, watching without being seen. She had learned long ago that leadership revealed itself most honestly when it wasn't announced. Emily's posture told her more than any report ever could. Alert, present, unafraid to be uncomfortable. Eleanor turned away and walked back to her office, already late for the next meeting. The calendar on her desk was full for the next 6 weeks, blocks of color stacked tightly together. Strategy sessions, route reviews, labor negotiations. The work of steering something too large to ever stop moving. Her assistant met her at the door. "We've received confirmation from the ethics committee," she said. "Final recommendations are ready." Eleanor nodded. "Send them to the board." "And one more thing," the assistant added. "Mr. Coleman's firm issued a statement this morning." Eleanor paused. Internal or public? Both. She took the document, scanned it quickly. Language softened, responsibility diffused. No names mentioned. A promise to review values. It was exactly what she had expected, enough to satisfy investors, not enough to change anything. "Thank you," Eleanor said, handing it back. "That will be all." Later that afternoon, Thomas Reed sat at a desk he did not recognize. The view was different, the noise level lower. No galley carts, no call buttons chiming. He adjusted his chair and opened the training manual assigned to him, the pages crisp, untouched. He read slowly, deliberately, stopping when a phrase caught his eye. Equal dignity, unwavering respect. He closed the book and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He had spent decades enforcing rules. He had believed that made him fair. Now he understood the difference between enforcement and judgment. Across town, Richard Coleman packed the last of his belongings into a box that felt too small for the life he had built. His office looked bare without the photographs, the awards, the reminders of relevance. The silence pressed in, louder than any argument he had ever won. He paused, holding a framed picture from a conference years ago. He looked confident in it, untouchable. He set it down carefully, then turned off the light. At Heritage Air, the weeks passed with quiet momentum. New training modules rolled out. Managers attended workshops they would once have dismissed as unnecessary. The changes were not flashy. They were precise, designed to endure. Emily found herself busier than ever, rotating through departments, absorbing information at a pace that left her exhausted and exhilarated. She sat in on planning meetings, listened to conversations she had never been meant to hear before. She learned how decisions rippled outward, affecting people she would never meet. One evening, as she gathered her things to leave, Eleanor appeared in the doorway. "Walk with me," she said. They moved through the building together, the halls nearly empty now, lights dimmed for the night shift. "You're doing well," Eleanor said. "But that's not why I wanted to talk." Emily waited. "There will be moments," Eleanor continued, "when you'll be tempted to smooth things over, to make the easier choice. You'll tell yourself it's practical, efficient. Sometimes it will even be framed as kindness." Emily nodded. She could already imagine those moments. "When that happens," Eleanor said, "remember how small the wrong choice can seem at first, and how large it becomes when it's allowed to stand." They reached the elevator. The doors slid open. Emily stepped inside, then turned back. "I won't forget," she said. Eleanor smiled, brief and sincere. On a quiet Sunday morning, Eleanor sat alone on her balcony, the city still waking beneath her. She held a cup of coffee she had long since forgotten to drink. The breeze carried distant sounds of traffic, of life continuing without ceremony. She thought of the people who would never know her name, but would feel the effects of the choices she made. Of the ones who would never be thanked. Of the ones who would never even realize something had been protected for them. That afternoon, she boarded another flight, this time under her own name. The recognition was immediate, respectful, almost reverent. She acknowledged it with a nod and took her seat. As the plane lifted, she felt the familiar surge again, the pressure, the hum, the sound of momentum, the sound of a system moving in the direction it was meant to go. Somewhere below, lives intersected in small, unseen ways. A young employee finding her footing, a seasoned worker relearning his purpose, a man grappling with the cost of his assumptions. The sky stretched wide and open ahead. Eleanor watched it through the window, steady and clear. The work was far from over, but it was finally aligned. The auditorium filled slowly, the kind of deliberate gathering that carried more weight than urgency. Employees took their seats in quiet clusters, the low murmur of conversation settling into anticipation. Word had traveled without detail. A company-wide address, mandatory attendance, no agenda shared in advance. Eleanor stood backstage, listening to the sound of the room through the curtain. It reminded her of boarding calls at a busy gate, that moment when people were present but not yet committed. She adjusted the cuff of her jacket, took a steady breath, and stepped forward. The lights softened as she reached the center of the stage. Applause rose out of habit, then faded when she lifted a hand. She did not smile. She did not rush. "I won't take much of your time," she said. Her voice carried easily, practiced without sounding rehearsed. "But I need your attention." The room leaned toward her, not physically, emotionally. "Over the past few weeks, many of you have heard fragments of a story," she continued. "A flight, a complaint, a decision. Some of you have filled in the blanks, Others have avoided them. I want to be clear about what matters and what does not. She paused, letting the silence do its work. What does not matter is who I am, Eleanor said. My title, my history, my role in this company, none of that should have been relevant in the moment that started this conversation. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle, uneasy. What does matter, she said, is how we respond when we believe no one important is watching. In the third row, Emily sat very still. Her hands rested flat against her thighs, grounding her. She felt the weight of the room pressing inward, not threatening, but expectant. Eleanor spoke of systems, of policy, of training, of the ways organizations drifted without noticing. She spoke of how small compromises accumulated, how convenience masqueraded as professionalism, how silence could be mistaken for neutrality. This company was not built on aircraft alone, she said. It was built on trust. And trust is not a slogan. It is a behavior. Thomas Reed sat near the aisle, eyes forward, face composed. He had been reassigned quietly, his new role less visible, less authoritative. He listened without defensiveness now, the words landing where they needed to. Eleanor did not name him. She did not name anyone. She didn't need to. There was a time, she continued, when I believed excellence would speak for itself. That if we built something strong enough, fair enough, it would protect the people inside it. I was wrong. Her voice softened, not with regret, but recognition. Systems protect themselves, unless we teach them to protect people. The room was silent. She shifted then, the cadence of her speech changing, not lighter but more precise. In response to what happened, we have made changes, Eleanor said. Not symbolic ones, structural ones. Training, reporting, escalation. These are not reactions. They are corrections. A screen behind her illuminated, displaying clear, concise bullet points. New protocols. Expanded authority for frontline employees. Independent review channels. Emily felt a flicker of pride, tempered by responsibility. There is something else, Eleanor said, lifting her gaze from the screen back to the audience. Something I want to say plainly. She paused. Courage does not always look like confrontation, she said. Sometimes it looks like documentation. Sometimes it looks like refusal. Sometimes it looks like standing still when someone expects you to move. Her eyes found Emily's row, not singling her out, but not avoiding her either. That kind of courage sustains organizations, Eleanor said. It prevents rot. Applause did not come immediately. People absorbed, reflected. Then, gradually, hands came together. The sound grew, not thunderous, but steady, earnest. Eleanor nodded once, accepting it without feeding on it. When the noise subsided, she spoke again. We will make mistakes, she said. That is inevitable. What defines us is whether we learn from them or disguise them. She stepped back. The lights shifted. The meeting was over. In the hours that followed, the building felt different. Conversations lingered longer. People listened more carefully. Not because they were afraid, but because something had been clarified. Emily returned to her desk and found an envelope waiting. Inside was a formal letter confirming her placement in the leadership development track. No fanfare, no flattery, just opportunity. She folded it carefully and placed it in her bag. That evening, Thomas walked the perimeter of the operations floor, observing rather than directing. He watched younger staff handle situations with confidence, saw managers pause before deciding, heard questions asked where silence might once have sufficed. He felt no bitterness, only resolve. Across town, Richard Coleman sat in a quiet restaurant he used to frequent often, the kind where staff recognized regulars by posture rather than name. Tonight, no one looked twice. He ordered simply, ate slowly, and listened to conversations that had nothing to do with him. He thought about the flight again, not with anger, but with clarity. About how easily he had assumed the world would adjust. About how wrong he had been. The check arrived. He paid without comment and left a tip larger than necessary, as if money could still smooth something over. It could not. Later that night, Eleanor returned home, shoes left by the door, jacket draped over a chair. She poured herself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching planes trace lines of light across the sky. She did not feel victorious. She felt aligned. The next morning, Heritage Air Flight 317 boarded on time. A different crew, a familiar route. Passengers took their seats, unaware of the small, deliberate shifts that now shaped the space around them. A woman hesitated at the aisle, unsure of her place. A flight attendant smiled and guided her gently. No drama, no announcement, just respect, practiced quietly. At cruising altitude, the cabin settled into its rhythm. Engines hummed, pages turned, coffee was poured. And somewhere between the clouds and the ground, the system held. The call came late in the afternoon, when the office had thinned out and the building had taken on that hollow, end-of-day echo. Eleanor was standing by the window, jacket draped over her chair, when her assistant's voice came through the intercom, quieter than usual. "There's a request coming in from compliance," she said. "External. It's regarding the flight incident. They want to interview you." Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not from reluctance, from recognition. This was the part that never made headlines. The part where stories were tested against records, where emotions were set aside, and facts were weighed like currency. "Schedule it," Eleanor said. "Tomorrow morning." When the call ended, she remained where she was, watching the sun slide between buildings. Power was often described as decisive, swift, absolute. In reality, it was slow, methodical, accountable. It asked to be examined. The next morning, the conference room was arranged differently. No long table, no hierarchy, just a circle of chairs, water glasses placed neatly at intervals. The representatives from compliance arrived on time, notebooks in hand, expressions neutral. They did not fawn. They did not flinch. Eleanor answered their questions without embellishment. She described the flight, the exchange, the response. She did not justify. She did not accuse. She let the sequence speak for itself. When it was over, one of the reviewers nodded slightly. "Thank you for your clarity," he said. "That makes our work easier." "That's the point," Eleanor replied. Elsewhere in the building, Emily sat in on her first executive-level meeting as an observer. She took notes quickly, aware of how much she didn't yet know. Acronyms flew past her. Timelines overlapped. But beneath it all, she sensed something new. A willingness to pause, to check, to ask whether an outcome aligned with intent. At one point, a senior manager proposed a solution that would have expedited a customer issue at the expense of a quieter passenger. The room hesitated. "That would solve the immediate problem," someone said, "but it creates another." Emily watched the discussion unfold, heart steady. This was how culture changed, not in speeches. In moments like this, when no one was watching for applause. Across town, Richard Coleman received another email, this one from an old colleague. The tone was polite, distant. A meeting declined, a door closing without ceremony. He read it twice, then deleted it. He spent the afternoon walking. No destination, just movement. The city moved around him, indifferent. People passed with purpose, phones pressed to ears, bags slung over shoulders. He had been one of them once. He still was, technically. But something essential had shifted. He stopped at a cafe and ordered coffee he barely tasted. At the next table, two women discussed a flight they'd taken recently. One mentioned how calm the crew had been when a seat mix-up happened, how respectfully it was handled. Richard felt a flicker of something he didn't name. At Heritage Air, the compliance review concluded quietly. Findings were documented, recommendations issued. No wrongdoing found at the systemic level, but clear areas for reinforcement. Eleanor read the summary carefully, then forwarded it to the board with a single line. We continue. That evening she attended a small dinner with industry peers. The conversation stayed light. Weather, routes, fuel costs. Someone mentioned a terminated negotiation in passing, careful not to look at her too directly. Eleanor smiled politely and changed the subject. Emily stayed late at the office, poring over training materials, annotating margins with questions. When she finally left, the sky was dark and the building nearly empty. She paused in the lobby, reflecting on how quickly things could change when someone chose not to look away. Thomas Reed finished his shift in Logistics Anderson, the work precise and invisible. He checked manifests, verified procedures. He had begun mentoring a younger employee, someone eager, someone who asked questions. He answered them honestly, without deflection. Don't rush decisions, he told her. The fastest answer isn't always the right one. She nodded, grateful. On the following weekend, Eleanor boarded a flight to Seattle. She traveled light, no entourage, no announcements. A few passengers recognized her, most did not. She took her seat and watched the cabin fill, the choreography of boarding unfolding smoothly. A man struggled with his bag in the aisle. A flight attendant stepped in quickly, not with irritation, but with patience. Another passenger offered help. The moment passed without tension. Eleanor felt something ease in her chest. Midway through the flight, turbulence rattled the cabin. Glasses clinked. Overhead bins creaked. The seatbelt sign chimed on. The crew moved calmly, voices steady, instructions clear. Passengers settled, reassured. Emily would have noticed this, Eleanor thought. The tone, the pacing, the respect embedded in routine. When the plane landed, applause broke out briefly, then faded. People gathered their things and disembarked, carrying their lives with them. Eleanor remained seated for a moment longer, letting the cabin empty. She stood last, feeling the familiar grounding as her feet touched the aisle. The hum lingered, a quiet echo of movement and intention. Outside, the air was cool and clean. She breathed it in, then stepped forward into the terminal, another traveler among many. Some stories ended loudly. This one did not. It moved forward, integrated into systems and habits, into the way people spoke and listened, into the way they chose to act when faced with the ordinary moments that defined everything else. And somewhere above the clouds, another plane traced its path across the sky, carrying with it the unseen weight of choices made and lessons learned, held aloft not by force, but by care. The first headline appeared just after sunrise, tucked halfway down a trade publication's daily brief, written in the careful language of restraint. Heritage Air restructures governance oversight following internal review. No names, no accusations, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. By noon, the phrasing began to change. Industry blogs picked it up, adding speculation, context, memory. By evening, the story had grown legs. It always did. Not because anyone fed it, but because the silence around it was too deliberate to ignore. Eleanor watched none of it unfold in real time. She had learned long ago that watching your reflection ripple through public water only distorted your sense of self. Instead, she focused on what was in front of her. A long table, stacks of briefing materials, the measured voices of people who understood the weight of precedent. The board meeting lasted hours. Discussions moved from ethics to exposure, from exposure to endurance. Some directors spoke cautiously, others more boldly. Eleanor listened to all of them, interrupting only when clarity was required. "We are not managing a scandal," she said at one point, her voice calm but immovable. "We are managing who we are willing to be when no one forces us to." That sentence landed harder than any raised voice could have. Pens stilled. A few heads nodded. The motion passed without dissent. Across town, Richard Coleman sat in a small office that no longer bore his name on the door. He had declined the offer to stay on as a consultant. Pride had done enough damage. He was not interested in prolonging it. He read the headlines slowly, recognizing the shape of his own absence in the language. He was not named, but he was implied. The man behind the pause, the shadow in the footnote. His phone buzzed once. An old colleague. A brief message. "I heard. I'm sorry." Richard set the phone down and stared out the window. He had spent his life believing outcomes were a function of leverage, pressure applied in the right places. He was only now beginning to understand that some systems did not respond to force at all. Emily learned of the coverage from a co-worker who leaned over her desk, eyes wide, voice low. "Have you seen this?" Emily glanced at the screen, then away. "I've heard," she said. She returned to her work, fingers steady on the keyboard. She knew better than most how much of the story would never be told. The moments that mattered rarely made print. The pause before a decision, the choice not to escalate, the refusal to move when asked. That afternoon, Eleanor called Emily into her office. The door closed softly behind them. No assistants, no observers. "I want you to sit in on the next route review," Eleanor said. "Not to speak, to listen." Emily nodded, a mix of excitement and gravity settling in her chest. "You'll hear people argue efficiency," Eleanor continued. "Cost, optics, all of it matters. But I want you to pay attention to what they don't say. Who is missing from the room? Whose inconvenience is being calculated?" Emily met her gaze. "I will." As she left, Eleanor felt the familiar ache of responsibility. Leadership was not about selecting successors. It was about making room for better instincts than your own. In the days that followed, Heritage Air became a quiet case study. Panels discussed it in measured tones. Consultants referenced it without attribution. Other companies took notes they would never admit to taking. Inside the airline, the changes continued without spectacle. Training sessions expanded. Reporting lines clarified. Authority redistributed in small but meaningful ways. A flight attendant now had clearer backing to pause a situation without fear. A supervisor had less room to trade dignity for quiet. Thomas Reed noticed the difference immediately. Conversations changed shape. Decisions took longer. He found himself asked for input rather than issuing directives. It was humbling. It was corrective. One evening, he stood on the tarmac, watching a plane prepare for departure. The engines whined softly, restrained, waiting. He thought about how often he had confused motion with progress. He resolved not to make that mistake again. Richard attended a dinner he had once hosted, now as a guest among many. No one treated him poorly. That was almost worse. Polite distance replaced deference. Conversations flowed around him without centering him. He listened more than he spoke, a skill he had neglected for decades. At one point, a younger man mentioned culture risk in passing, using the phrase as if it were common knowledge. Richard flinched, just slightly. He understood now how language moved faster than reputation ever could. Late that night, Eleanor walked through her building alone. The cleaning crew worked quietly, nodding as she passed. She paused in the operations center, lights dimmed, screens glowing with steady streams of data. Flights in motion, routes traced, lives intersecting far above the ground. She thought of the woman who had hesitated in the aisle weeks ago, of the attendant who had stepped forward, of the man who had believed the world would bend because it always had before. None of them were villains. None of them were saints. They were people moving through systems that either corrected or amplified their instincts. Her phone buzzed once, a message from the board chair. The vote was complete, the decision formalized, the path forward confirmed. Eleanor typed a brief reply. "Thank you. We proceed." Outside, the city hummed. Somewhere overhead, a red eye cut across the dark sky, its lights blinking in quiet rhythm. Inside that cabin, someone shifted in their seat, unaware of the frameworks holding the moment together. Emily finished her day with a sense of earned exhaustion. She stepped outside and looked up, tracking a plane as it disappeared into cloud. She felt no pride in being right, only gratitude that being right had mattered. Richard returned home and placed his keys in a bowl he had not touched in weeks. The house felt too large, too quiet. He poured himself water instead of something stronger and sat down, letting the stillness settle. He did not know what came next. For the first time in his life, he did not try to force an answer. And Eleanor, standing at the window of her office as night reclaimed the city, felt something rare. Not relief, not satisfaction. Alignment. The system had been tested. It had bent. It had corrected. And tomorrow, it would fly again. The morning broke clean and pale, the kind of light that made the city look honest even when it wasn't. Eleanor stood at the window of her office before anyone else arrived, watching the first departures lift into the sky. Each aircraft rose with practiced certainty, metal and intention working together, carrying hundreds of unseen stories forward. The week had settled, the noise had faded. What remained was quieter and heavier than headlines. Decisions now lived in policy, in training manuals, in the tone people used when no supervisor was near. This was the part that lasted. Her assistant arrived with a small stack of folders, setting them down without comment. Eleanor flipped through them slowly. Follow-up reports, revised procedures, notes from regional managers describing subtle changes they were seeing already. Fewer escalations, more pauses, better listening. She closed the last folder and exhaled. Downstairs, the lobby filled with the low rhythm of a workday beginning. Employees greeted one another with nods and brief smiles. Nothing performative, nothing forced. Just people showing up to do their jobs with a slightly different awareness than before. Emily arrived early, as she had been doing lately, a habit she hadn't noticed forming until it was already there. She set her bag down, powered up her screen, and scanned her schedule for the day. Meetings she would once have watched from the sidelines now included her name. Not centered, included. She remembered the flight clearly. Not the tension, but the stillness afterward. The moment she'd realized that writing something down mattered. That choosing not to disappear was a decision in itself. Across town, Richard Coleman sat at his kitchen table, coffee cooling in his mug. The city outside his window moved without him now. He watched it with an unfamiliar patience. He had declined 2 invitations that morning, not out of bitterness, but because he no longer wanted to be in rooms where he felt entitled to control the outcome. He thought about the woman on the plane, about how little he had known, and how much he had assumed. The lesson hadn't arrived with drama. It had arrived with silence, with doors closing gently and completely. At Heritage Air, Eleanor gathered her leadership team for a brief standing meeting. No slides, no speeches. "We're moving forward," she said. "Not because we handled something well, but because we chose to learn from it." She met each pair of eyes in turn. "This will not be the last time we're tested," she continued. "But next time, I expect fewer surprises." There were nods, quiet agreements, No applause. Later that day, Eleanor walked the terminal unannounced, passing gates and waiting areas, watching the choreography she knew so well. A gate agent calmed a frustrated traveler with steady reassurance. A flight attendant knelt to speak to an older man at eye level. Small acts, unremarkable on their own, meaningful together. She paused near a window overlooking the runway. A plane idled, waiting clearance. Engines low, controlled, ready. The intercom crackled softly. Boarding announcements began. People lined up, carrying their days with them. Emily crossed the terminal on her way to observe another route briefing. She caught sight of Eleanor in the distance and felt a flicker of something like gratitude. Not for opportunity, for permission, to notice, to choose. That evening, Eleanor returned home later than usual. She set her keys down, slipped off her shoes, and stood in the quiet of her living room for a long moment. The city lights blinked outside, indifferent and alive. She thought about legacy, not as something etched into stone, but as something practiced daily. A tone set, a boundary held, a moment where someone chose not to look away. The next morning, Heritage Air Flight 317 boarded again. Different passengers, same route. A woman hesitated in the aisle, uncertain. A crew member stepped forward, voice calm, offering help without assumption. The moment passed smoothly, almost invisibly. At cruising altitude, the cabin settled into its familiar rhythm. Engines hummed, pages turned, coffee was poured. Life continued. Eleanor watched the clouds slide past the window, soft and endless. She felt no need to announce herself. The work did not require it. Somewhere behind her, a passenger smiled in quiet relief. Somewhere ahead, a decision would be made differently than it once might have been. That was enough. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about choices that shape who we become.